Hello again, consultants, and welcome back to session number 2 on needs analysis. So today we're going to refer back to chapter 2 of our book, Sleazer, and I'd like to talk a little bit about ideas, models that are going to guide our practice for needs analysis. So without further ado, let's go ahead and just get started. And just to recap a little bit, on the previous session, you probably heard that we have types of needs, and I wanted to superimpose another level. This is another level of needs that you are going to see when you go through your graduate program, or if you talk to other experts as well. So this is Alshud and Kumar. So they have 6 different types of needs. So they have the normative need, and as you can see, we have some examples like the ACT or the GMAT, and so now you can see why they are normative, because they are trying to normalize the performance of people. Then we have competitive needs, and those are usually like we see at the Olympics, that we see in chess clubs, in quick recall, etc. We have also things like the felt needs, and that's usually when I start making the transition to the corporate environment. People that feel like they have a need, they will come to you and they say, I have this need, and they will immediately begin to describe it, but they haven't really analyzed it to see if it really is a need or not, and that's where you come in. So they just have the sense. Then we have the express needs. Those are things that we want to get better at, or things that we believe are going to take us to the next level. Again, in the corporate environment, these are the needs that are going to help the company produce more, get more revenue, or service better. We also have the anticipator of future needs. This is very rare in companies, but it is possible when we want to try to get ahead. And so a visionary leader is usually going to be expressing needs that are anticipator, or things that are going to help us a future. So the last one in this particular group of types is the critical need, and usually this is the fires that we hear people are putting out every day at work. So we have to also continue to evaluate that plan of the company and what they need to do, and how the correction parameters are needed, and there you go. That's where the need comes in. So recapping on the last session, the previous ones you hadn't heard. These ones are specifically from Sleazer, and they are not necessarily different. They are just categorized a little differently in terms of time or duration, and also the what makes the needs. And so further, what I'm talking about is, so thinking about the strategic needs, you can still have future needs that are strategic. So that's just to kind of get you an idea of how you can mishmash the two. But in this particular case, the reason why I separated the strategic needs specifically is because anything that relates to strategy is going to take a long time to get done. Then we have the operational or tactical needs, and those are things that are going to help us fill that gap in a short term. We're going to try to get something done in a month, in a quarter, in the next 6 months, or depending on how our company works, if it's the fiscal year, etc. Then we have the individual or performance need, and that's, if you recall in my previous session, I was talking about the personal behaviors, the performance capacity, the accomplishments, the skills of that person in getting something done. I'm sorry, not the skills necessarily, but rather what they need to do for the company or for that department to get things done. So it is getting a little bit more into the person type of need. And then of course you have the learning need itself, which this one does address the skills and the knowledge of people. Example that I have used before is when we are hired for a position, we are hired based on our credentials and our previous experience, but that does not by any means put the seal of approval on how to do a work in a new company, especially when we are not aware of their tactics and their processes and their procedures, etc. So there's always a slight change. A VCO chart is always a VCO chart, but depending on what the protocol is for that company, we will have to learn to do that differently for that company to fit those standards. And so that's where this one falls in. And then, of course, when we do the needs analysis, we should come up with the business analysis, which dictates the strategy or the operational goals, the performance analysis, which actually talks about the capacity process for producing accomplishments or for producing a service or a product, the cause analysis, which is a specific reason for the performance gaps. So once we have validated the need, then we have to get into the what is causing it. And then the last one is the training analysis. And usually, if you recall my saying before, not everything is solved with training, and that's unfortunately a paradigm that some people need to shift from. Training is not going to fix everything, and sometimes training is not needed. And so we still need to do that training analysis sometimes when it is warranted. So when we have validated that yes, indeed, training is needed, in what sense it is going to correct a problem. So something that we read in our book is this worldview comparison, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about it. This is really good. So put yourselves in the shoes of consultants. So when you are going to try to figure out a needs analysis for your client, and your client has come to you and said, hey, I have this need, the very first thing that you have to remember is that you're going to have your worldview of things as an assessor. In other words, you probably don't feel the need, you probably don't see the need, you probably didn't think of that need. And it could be for many reasons. One of them could be because you are not in that company, you are a consultant, an external consultant. But if you are in that company, you also may have some bias. So you have to be careful with that. So you have your view. And then you have the client's worldview. The client is usually the one who's going to come into you and say, hey, I have this need, usually, before you go to your client to say anything. So they are going to have their view, their preconceived notions of why something is needed. So like that, when it comes to the decision making, that also will happen based on the worldview of each one. So remember that when you are providing your executive summary and your potential solution or recommendations, you are going to execute the worldview of the assessor that does not necessarily need to match with the client worldview. And so that's where you have to keep in mind that there will be some discrepancy. And then, of course, the related language, which is also based on the worldview. And that is something very, very obscure. But the reason why I brought it up is because when you talk about the needs, they are usually going to be expressed in a certain topic, in a certain industry, in a certain vacuum of sorts. And that requires a certain vernacular, a certain terminology, certain acronyms. So you also have to remember that the worldview is going to be that of the language that is used in that space. So be careful with that. These are just words of warning for you to keep in mind when you are going to conduct your needs analysis, because we don't want to be biased, and that is the most important thing of an assessor. To take it a step further, here's an example extracted from one of the pages from our book. So this is one of the perspectives. So the person that is an achiever, their worldview is going to think that there are opportunities. Every time something is going to give you the half full glass kind of perspective. The reasonable actions of somebody with this view is take enterprising actions that benefit that person and that focus on results and self-reliance. So usually the person that is an achiever is always going to be forward, but is going to be also limited in terms of their view because of that hopeful and wishful thinking. So let's be careful with that. And then, of course, when it comes to the application of that worldview of the achiever, so achieving materialistic rewards, as you see on the screen, and making things better for oneself are important. So these are things for us to focus on when we are talking to a client or when we are being the assessors. So take a look at what the worldview is and then consider the perspective based on that so that we can keep ourselves on check and we are not beginning to formulate our own agenda, or worse yet, we are not just serving the agenda of our client, which one of the biggest things that I will re-emphasize every time that we meet is our job is not necessarily to say yes to our client. Our job is precisely to take that shroud away from the client's eyes and present factual information. whichever way it goes. We just have to do it very diplomatically and very in an executive manner, but we should do that. And that's why we are being brought in to do that needs analysis. So 3 components here to measure performance efficiently. So the first one is definitely to compare the accomplishments of that person that is usually the one that is a high performer. There is a process that some organizations use where they bring 5 high performers and then they have them validate everything that happens or hear what is it that they do differently. And so based on that, they will design the intervention that is going to help everybody else who's not doing it that way to do it like these high performers. So that's a really good practice. How does this matter into the needs analysis? Well, usually, if we are doing a qualitative analysis, we want to go to those high performers, if it's a performance issue, and interview them and see what is it that they do, how do they do it, what do they do differently. So it's important always to keep an eye on that. The problem is sometimes you have to be very covert in how you do it, and that's where the observations come in. So we will talk a little bit more about the methodologies later, but something for you to keep in mind. The second thing for us to keep in mind to measure performance efficiently is to identify the patterns. Usually this is very helpful in manufacturing or in an assembly line format. When we are in an office, it's a little more difficult, unless, of course, there is a paper process that is always followed. But when you are more relying on people's personalities and people's judgment, subjective judgment, then those patterns are a little more difficult to identify. But otherwise, usually we want to figure out what those are. That's where observation comes in again, and sometimes historical data. What is the performance of this particular department during the winter season, etc. So patterns are really good. And then the third measure of performance efficiently is find the specific behaviors that contribute to differences in the process or things that are going to create those spikes, if you will. And sometimes people don't want to highlight those things for whatever reason, but that is the one thing that as a needs analysis specialist or consultant, we need to keep that lens and figure out who or where are those efficiencies happening. Those behaviors that are different than the traditions or the ones that skip out of the pattern that create positive results. Those are the things we also need to keep in mind to A, validate the need, or B, help find solutions for that need. So with those, I hope you guys get a good starting point, and we will continue to meet and talk about other components of the needs analysis. I'll see you soon.